Hello and welcome to the Drexel InterView. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, speaking to you from the Paul Peck Alumni Center at Drexel University. Today my guest is Ishmael Beah. He was a child soldier in Sierra Leone in the mid-1990s until rescued by UNICEF and eventually sent to the United States, where he lived in New York City and then attended Oberlin College. Beah is the author of the acclaimed memoir, A Long Way Gone, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier, and the recent novel, Radiance of Tomorrow. Ishmael Beah, welcome to the Drexel InterView.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first your memoir. In your memoir, you deal with your life as a child soldier during the Civil War in Sierra Leone, and your rehabilitation, so to speak, in America. And I wonder whether that book, and I also want to talk soon about your new novel, was a kind of catharsis, a way for you of coming to terms with some of what you had endured.
Well, during the writing of the book, of the memoir itself, A Long Way Gone, I did not anticipate that it would be cathartic or that it would actually have any kind of healing process for me. But after I'd finished writing it, I realized it was the first time that I allowed myself to go back and actually observe what I'd experienced, because I wanted to bring it to the readers in a very intimate way, that I could only do so by going back into those places that were very difficult. So after I was finished, I realized that I learned more about myself and what I'd actually gone through, and I would have never done it if it wasn't through writing.
What compelled you to write? What caused you, had you always had that proclivity to write?
I'm not sure if I've always had it, but I remember when I was a child, I was always very excited about literature than anything else. I was studying economics as a kid. When I knew that I didn't like it, but I still studied it. But whenever it was something about literature, whether reading a Shakespeare piece or Robert Louis Stevenson Treasure Island, I would be very excited about it. And also when I was writing like letters, just letters for people in my community, it brought me an excitement. So really what led to writing of the memoir was out of a frustration, really, trying to find a way to prepare myself to be able to have an argument and be able to say certain things very concrete but succinctly about what had occurred in my country, to give the necessary human context that I felt was missing in the way they were describing my country, but also how they were speaking about children who had come out of this war. They used to call us the lost generation, and that really angered me. So I started writing in preparation to counter these arguments.
Why did this anger you, the choice of that term, the lost generation?
Well, first of all, we were not lost generation. I was living in the United States, and some of the people who were making these conclusions, if I walked past them or some of my friends without having said anything about myself, they would not even know that we had had that experience. That's what I didn't like, because that meant that we were time-bound, we were only capable of violence and nothing more, just because our lives have been consumed by it.
That is something that comes through very strongly in your novel, which I want to get to, the sense of resilience and the fact of being able to recuperate from things. I am struck by the fact that as a child soldier, you had a gun, and then as a young adult, you had a pen. Both are instruments of power. And I wonder if you've thought about that connection, the transition from the gun to the pen.
I've actually never thought about it, but it's a great observation. Well, yeah, but I mean, one I use, of course, the usage of one is different from the other. One I used in a way to stay alive, but also to engage in violence. And then the other one I used to perhaps write about that violence, to have people understand what it does to the human spirit, really. So the other I use more to shed light on my tradition and the wisdom of my people and the place that I'm coming from, to introduce people to get a better understanding about this place, you know.
Tell us about your first impression of the United States when you came here. I guess you were sent via UNICEF to the U.S. I'm not quite sure of the trajectory.
Yes, the first time I came to the U.S. was in '96, and I had come for a conference that was following a study that a woman called Graça Machel had done, and the wife of Nelson Mandela, past Nelson Mandela, had done on the impact of armed conflict on children around the world. So she had interviewed children from all over the world, including Sierra Leone, and they sent 2 young people from all of these places for the launch of this study. So that's how I came to the United States the first time, and that's the first time I actually had a passport. You know, in Sierra Leone, it's a luxury item, even though it's a right. And first time I was on a plane, and my first impression, actually when I was coming, I did not want to come to New York because what I had seen in New York of people who had electricity and had television was a very violent place with people driving fast cars and shooting at each other. And I was just coming out of a war, so I was not interested in being anywhere where that was the case, you know. But of course I arrived, that wasn't the case, but it was very cold.
You weren't used to that?
I wasn't used to that either, so yeah.
But you ended up eventually settling in New York.
Yes, I ended up settling there. After I went back, after the conference, I had befriended a woman called Laura Sims, who later became my mother. She helped me to come back to the United States, and I started living in New York. And I learned to tolerate the cold to some extent.
And you live there still, right?
I live there still. Yeah.
So after you came to the States and you were college age, you went to Oberlin College, which is a very liberal school, also a very privileged one.
Yes.
So I wonder what your impressions were of that world of American college life, and particularly college life at Oberlin.
Well, when I was actually in last year of high school, I looked at several colleges, and I had made the decision that I wanted to go to some place very small so that I would really get that attention, because I hadn't been in school as consistently as my peers. So, when I visited Oberlin, I had learned a little bit about its history. And I was taken a little bit by the fact that it had a significant number of African students. So that was one of the things that drew me to it. And so I went there. When I started first, I took a rhetoric and composition class because I wasn't sure whether my writing was strong for school. And during that class taught by a Professor Laurie Macmillan, they asked us to write stories about our childhood. You know, and everybody was writing about how they played with their dogs and things like that. And I thought, all right, I shouldn't write about other aspects of my childhood. So I wrote about playing with a particular item when I was a kid. And then she recognized something in there. And then I stopped writing. And later on, I began to take 1 or 2 creative writing classes. And a professor called Dan Shawn, who's a novelist, took me under his wing. And so I really started writing. I discovered that I had this talent really there.
You really do have a talent. It's quite extraordinary. This book is wonderful. And in it, in the novel, you returned to your homeland after the war, as you did yourself go back to Sierra Leone.
Yes.
And I guess before we talk about the novel itself, I wonder about if you could tell us a little bit about that return and how you felt going back.
Well, the first time I went back, it was right after the war had ended, and it was very difficult because the remnants and the reminders of the war were very, very strong. You can see them. You can see the bullet holes in the walls, you can see the burnt cars on the side of the street and various other things. So it began, the nightmares and the flashbacks began to take a toll of me again. But I persisted going back to the same places over and over again, and over the years it became quite easy. And so I witnessed that experience, and also other people going back and myself, and beginning to make that connection to the land again, and to see certain things afresh again, if possible. And it was very difficult, but
So you think it was this repeated going back that helped you to sort of get beyond the surface trauma of seeing your country as it looked after the fact?
Yes, but I mean, there's also a draw because it's home. Regardless of the fact that things have happened there that have sort of shattered the structures that we had in place and the traditions, it is still home. So you have this longing for it, but then when you get there, there are other things, immediately after the war, there are other things that then were not very nice to think about. You know, but going back slowly, there were things that began to occur, the life began to resume again. And even I'll give one example that I saw. There was a path in the memoir that I described that when the war first reached my life, that I was running a mango tree, and you know, there are bullet holes in it and things like that, that people, you know, and bodies were littered on the path. And I went back slowly, and every time I would walk this path, and I began to see that the very trees that had the bullet holes in them, the bark has sort of changed. The bark had fallen off, and a newer one was growing, and the tree was growing again. And you can see a boy or a little girl walking on the path by themselves with no worry in their face at all. So when you begin to see these things, you realize that, okay, I can begin to trust this place again. You know?
And things can heal.
Yes.
And that's, well, certainly at the beginning of Radiance of Tomorrow, that's what you deal with. You deal with a new beginning, and with these 2 older characters, Mama Katie and Pa Moiwa.
Yes, Mama Katie and Pa Moiwa,
Yeah,
yes.
who come, elderly people who are the first to return to a devastated village and begin the process of rebuilding, gathering the bones and burying them and so forth. I wondered, I mean, these characters are very compelling, I thought. Are they modeled after elders that you knew, or are they a composite, or are they based on an idea of something in your past? Talk to us a little bit about these two characters.
It's a combination of several things. They're modeled on the idea of what it meant to be an elder before the war. But also I try to imagine what it would have felt like for my grandmother to return after the war, and what it would feel like for other older people to return, and how what that toll might have been on them. And also in our tradition, it is believed that whenever there is something has happened with the land, the elders are the first to rekindle their broken friendship with it. So that's why I made them come first, so that they can begin to prepare the ground and prepare even the ancestors to return, so that the people can return and begin that connection. And they begin to do that. But also I wanted some practical things to be there, because during the war, when people are running around and they're gunned down, nobody's going around and burying them. So when you return to your towns and villages and your paths and roads, you have to clean all of these things. And every now and then you'll discover some under the shrubs here and there. But so they come back and start to do even those basic things, and start to actually clean the place, but also so that they can call on other people to come back in a way, you know?
Yeah, you do a beautiful job showing this gradual return of different people of different ages and different family configurations. And then the two teachers, Benjamin and Bakari.
Yes.
Tell us about where they come from in your imagination.
Generally, it could be anywhere in Sierra Leone. It could be in any other country that's a post-war country, where people are returning home and they're trying to find a suitable place to keep their families together. As that is occurring also, you see Benjamin is running away from another part of his own country, in the country, where he realizes that he cannot live anymore. So he's finding another suitable place. So you have a lot of this going on, where people are kind of constantly looking for where it is that they can function after the war, where it is that they can begin to try and go back to what their lives had been, if possible. If not, what forms of traditions do they repair? So these teachers come and they're trying to bring back the school. There's a principal, they're trying to build a school again so the kids can go to school, to bring a sense of normalcy within their lives and to keep their families together as well.
And the fact that they're teachers seems so important. The rekindling of education, bringing the young people into the schools, seems so central to the notion of rebuilding this town.
Yes, it certainly is, because the other thing I was trying to get at is that before the war in Sierra Leone, education was very revered.
Yes.
You know, I grew up in a former British colony, but we had a sense of very rigorous nature of education. If anything, that's the only thing your parents will actually give you. You would not ask for toys. It was not even heard of. But you would ask for a book, an exercise book or a pen, you know, and they would gladly give you one. And actually, you know, when I was growing up as a kid, my father only celebrated when you came with your results at the end of the school year if it was good.
Yeah.
Your birthday, any of these things, it was not important. You know. So I was trying to reintroduce some of those things that had existed again, that were part of how people's life had been.
Also, another aspect of the book that I thought was very compelling is the storytelling part of life in the village, and the way in which the older people tell stories to the younger people. And I wonder about this as part of your inheritance, and whether you were conscious of the fact that you grew up maybe with stories that might have inspired you to now become a writer and tell stories yourself.
Yes, certainly. I grew up with the oral tradition, and so I think even before I knew I could ever be a writer, that was really my early sort of narrative structure. I learned it from that. Because when you're telling a story orally, you're trying to capture the imagination of your listener and bring them to the landscape of the story and keep them there until you release them. And in order to do that, you have to give them cues, visual cues, with language, with sounds, with feelings, with the mannerisms of the character, so that they can actually know where they are and feel where they are. So when I'm writing, I bring some of that knowledge as well into how I'm writing.
Did you get this from your grandmother?
Yes, my grandmother is my sort of philosopher my moral philosopher. She would say these things to me when I was a kid, and even up to now, she just says some wonderful things to me every now and then, and I'll try to figure out what it is that they mean. But most elders will say this to you, particularly in the countryside. The idea also of the story is the fact that they will pass it on to the next generation. Because the idea that if the stories don't get passed on into the next vessel, they won't be able to live on, they will die. And therefore the wisdom and the traditions will die along with them. And what that does is that it makes the next generation not strong enough to withstand whatever life throws at them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense in the wake of the devastation that occurred in your country, that the story becomes that much more powerful as a way to keep the past alive. You also speak about your native language, Mende?
Yes.
And the fact that you try in this book to capture some of the imagery, the lyricism that's embedded in that language. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, maybe even give us an example of that.
Well, in Mende and many other languages in Sierra Leone are very figurative, and they're filled with images and sometimes in parables, the way people speak, and you make sounds of things, you know. So I'm also trying to bring that in. So for example, how you say, night came suddenly, you say the sky rolled over and changed its sides. So if I write the sky rolled over and change its side, first of all, the reader knows that they are not. They are somewhere different, in a different landscape. How you say a ball, you call it fefete, which means a nest of air, a vessel that carries air.
A ball is a nest of air.
Yes.
I love that.
So if I were to say the children kicked around a nest of air or a vessel that carries air, all of a sudden the reader is going to pay a little bit more attention, be like, wow, well, that's interesting. So I actually find the English equivalent of some things. If not, then I find a way to describe the feeling of it, so that the reader can be in that landscape, you know.
It's wonderful the way you do that. I actually would like you to read from the book. I've chosen a passage that's particularly dramatic, I think difficult in a way to read, in some ways beautiful. And I guess I'll say that this is a character who had been a child soldier. The character in this case is described with a family that he will later meet again when he goes back to the town. And in this particular case, he has to commit a terrible act upon them. So I thought we could start here in the morning.
Okay. In the morning, the commander asked a slim little boy with a long, rough, pimpled face, they called him Sergeant Cutlass, to chop off the family's hands. I am in a very good mood, so you only have your hands cut off. You can keep your lives for today, the commander had said. I am giving you my best man for the job. He's so good that by the time you think about it, it will be finished. He laughed and called on the sergeant. The young boy's sunken face was as cold as the blades he carried. All of them had residues of blood and flesh, and some were dull while others were very sharp. Depending on how much pain the commander wanted his victims to feel, he would ask for either a dull or sharp machete. This young boy had been forced at gunpoint to do his first cutting when he was 9 years old, and they were the hands of his mother, father, grandmother, and 2 uncles. Afterward, the commander had killed them because the boy didn't do the job to his liking. It wasn't as clean as I wanted, he had said before shooting all of them. The commander had then made the boy part of the group to fight as a soldier with the special task of chopping off hands only. Okay, bring them here, the commander asked for Sila and his children to be brought to the log near the bushes. Sergeant Cutlass, go on, and we move out after. One last thing, if any one of you make any noise, I will have you all shot. He laughed as the hands of the children were first placed on the logs and cut, and then it was Sila's turn. Sergeant Cutlass had cut many hands, but this was the second time that it tormented him. The first had been his family. He didn't know what it was, but something about this family got to him. He had also never witnessed such silence from cuts. Even when the commander threatened to shoot people, they cried out. Not this family, though. The silence made him hear the sound that the machete made when it went through the flesh, the bone, and then the flesh again, finally hitting the log.
Was it difficult to write that?
Some of the characters it was difficult to write because either I have a knowledge of some of the things that I was writing about, but also I had to step in the shoes of other people that I were not necessarily the other side of the war that I wasn't part of. You know, one of the characters that was really difficult to write was another former child soldier called Cornell. And for him, it was more trying to create a balance, not endorsing violence, but using the methodologies he's learned from the war to maintain his dignity and the dignity of his people. And so these things were sort of difficult, but it's a challenge. That's the part of writing.
And that you're a writer, you do it. The town that you describe here, the village, is gradually rebuilt and then devastated again through the entry of a mining operation that destroys it more slowly and in some ways in a more devastating way. Have you seen this sort of corporate exploitation happen in Sierra Leone since the war?
Well, yes, in Sierra Leone and other places there are this, because what happens when in post-war, when wars end, most companies are not willing to go because they're afraid of how volatile the place is. So then this gives rise to companies with not the best records to come and say, well, we can be here, and then they begin to do certain things. So if you see in the narrative, even the characters are split on whether they want the company or not, because people do want their natural resources to be extracted so they can benefit from it, but they don't want it to be at their own demise when it is done. So you see sort of that, but these things are occurring, definitely, in Sierra Leone and in any other places. And the point that I'm trying to make is this: during the war, with these characters, during the war, people were gunned down. It was a kind of different kind of manners, but you knew you could come back to your land, to your village at some point. But with the mining, they flood the place and they destroy it. So you know you cannot come back to your land. There's nothing to return to. So that in itself is more painful.
Yeah.
Particularly because these characters' relationship to land is different. It's not just a place where they live, it's where their ancestors are buried and where they have their histories and their traditions. So that became a little bit more complicated.
It's interesting because just recently there was an article about an actor, Jeffrey Wright, who has gone to Sierra Leone. I don't know if you're familiar.
Yes, I am familiar.
Yeah, and he's involved in a gold mining operation there, and I was struck. I wanted to ask you, do you feel there are some good mining operations, or there's some operations that are actually healthy for the country and being carried out appropriately, or do you think the whole notion of this sort of exploitation of the land is not in keeping with this notion of homeland or village that you think about as proper to your country?
Well, I think in many, I have yet to see good functioning companies in a lot of countries, but there are other countries that have shown that it's possible. For example, in Botswana, you have a lot of diamond mining companies that are very good, but it requires the leadership to set it up in a way and make the demands and the ways in which the extraction occurs and the benefits where it goes. So it really relies on the leaders to do that. And if they can set those parameters, then and actually monitor what is being done, then I think it will work. But if they can't, then you have these other companies coming and they already have another. They're not going to do it for the country, because they want money. So mining is not entirely bad. It's the methodology.
And the question is how much control one can have.
How much control one can have.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's been much documented that many of the child soldiers took drugs as a way to get through the process and to dull their senses in this situation. You yourself, has there been any after effects to that, any feelings that you've had about drug taking or whatever based on that life that you led?
There's always this fascination, of course, with doing drugs when people are young and things like this. But just to really, if you really look at it, what it does to you is not for your benefit at all. Whatever it is that you're trying to deal with, it doesn't help you in the long run. It just becomes a quick fix, something to band-aid a bigger wound for a shorter time. And that's what we did during the war, and we became addicted to it because it allowed us not to think about what was in our heads. And then after we no longer had access to them, it became increasingly difficult to withdraw from them, but to even deal with the memories themselves.
And to deal with life.
With life itself. So if you want to really live life fully, you cannot take shortcuts.
You seem to have such I would say, and this book shows it too, an optimistic, a resilient, a cheerful attitude toward life. Do you think that's you, or do you think it's the people of Sierra Leone in
It
general?
is the people of Sierra Leone in general. It is in our culture, it is in our tradition, and I think this part of that where our resilience comes from. And I think also what this characters will introduce you is this concept that happiness is not a continuum, it's not this prolonged thing.
Yeah.
It's moments, and how you appreciate those moments. So with the backdrop of all of the things that are going on, people are happy. If they watch a football, soccer match, they will watch it and talk and laugh. If they go to a disco, they will dance. They will love genuinely and truly. They will create families with the backdrop of all of this. So happiness is not the absence of challenge in one's life. It's with those challenges the ability to move on, to live life fully, and that's the strength of my people. And so that's what's in me. You know, so that's why.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, we're out of time, but I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you for being here today, Ishmael Beah.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel Interview.